Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon, Team Krulak community. My name is Major Ian Brown. I'm the Operations Officer at the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who can't join us today. So we ask that you be mindful of keeping your microphones muted to avoid disrupting the presentation, as well as turning off your own webcams until we do Q&A to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So hopefully we get Dr. Valeriano back with us for that. And then if you have a question, just go ahead and type it into the chat function, and we will get to as many as we can while we have Dr. Windsor with us. And so with that, Dr. Windsor, I'll turn it over to you for your introduction, and then we'll get going.
I'm delighted to introduce Leah Windsor. She is a research assistant professor at the Institute for Intelligent Systems at the University of Memphis, where she directs the Language Across Cultures and Languages Across Modalities labs. Dr. Windsor is a PI for the DoD Minerva Initiative grant that examines political communication in authoritarian regimes, and the PI for Smart City Memphis grant, Language and Community Responsiveness. She's also doing some great work on gender, parenthood, work-life balance, and has a forthcoming Georgetown book, so I really appreciate that work. And most importantly of all, she is a non-resident Krulak Fellow with the Marine Corps University. So with that, I'll leave it to Leah to dive into her presentation, and we'll ask some questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to get to share some of the work that I've been doing over the past few years, and I'm excited to be one of the non-resident fellows of the Krulak Center. And okay, so I study language patterns in international relations. So broadly speaking, my overarching research question that drives all of my work is, how does what we say reveal who we are? And is it what we say, the content, or is it how we say it, the structure of the way that we present what we think? And then also, what biases influence our understanding of international relations? This is generally the workflow that I use in investigating whatever particular question I'm looking at. So starting with the research question, what is it that's puzzling me? In general, I'm interested in language in opaque environments, whether it's authoritarian political regimes or violent extremist organizations, places where it's, there might be a disconnect between what's said and what the individual regime or group's behavior is. And then I look at the data generating process. Most of the language and corpora that I work with is unique, meaning that I gather it myself, although I have used some off-the-shelf corpora in my work. But over the last few years, I've really been thinking about, especially in the bias aspect, in what language and with what tools. So how do we know what we know if we're predominantly looking at English language and English language sources and sources from the Western Europe and OECD countries? And I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a bit. And then thinking about the theoretical framework, what are the overarching perspectives that inform this question? And then thinking deeper than that, what sources inform the theory? I mean, so much of the way that we think about the world in political science and international relations is derived from a small subset of geography and text. So how do we think more big picture about what people mean when they use a particular kind of language, and where do we fit that in the literature? And then finally, the feature selection based on the theoretical expectations. So that's generally how my workflow goes. So this was one of the big projects that I looked at in the Minerva grant. So this is the map of the world. This is the average standard formality by country. And so what we see here in this map, especially over time, is that countries exhibit much more variation when you look at language than other indicators that are some of the standard country year observational data like polity, for example, that doesn't vary in many countries over time. But language really does exhibit a lot of variation. So in this picture, we see the countries that are colored more green tend to be much more formal, and the countries that are colored more blue tend to be much less formal. And the way that I explain this is that the institutionalization level of the country, even above and beyond regime type, is what helps to constrain what leaders say in the UNGA forum every year. So, for example, China and Brazil and the United States and Scandinavian countries and Australia and New Zealand, and India, all generally have the same level of formality, meaning that they are very, very informal. And what this says is that they have an in-group mentality, that they're part of an inner circle. They don't see themselves as outsiders. They're speaking to peers. Whereas other countries that tend to be colored more green, when you speak in a more formal register, that identifies you as either a subordinate and or as an outsider. And so if you're speaking more formally, you are attempting to accomplish legitimacy amongst your peers or amongst the international community with your language. So the countries that are shaded more green tend to use profuse honorifics and much more complex language than the countries that are shaded more blue, which is much more straightforward. And I'll get to an explanation of this in just a bit. Here's another example of some of the work that came out of the Minerva grant. One of the things that I was interested in was how politically closed regimes like North Korea, what we can learn from politically closed regimes like North Korea through the type of language that they disseminate. So every day the North Korean state media puts out somewhere between 5 and 20-ish press releases. And what we found is that there's a lot more signal in the noise than we expected. I think in many cases people dismiss state media as being propaganda, which it is, but as being content-free or message-free. But there's some deep underlying trends in North Korean state media that we've uncovered. So on the left, we have 3 examples from 2 different situations. One was in 2014 when North Korea threatened to retaliate for the movie The Interview, and then on the right when they threatened to attack Guam. And so this is really distinguishing between international threats and bluffs. So on the left, you see the average anger level in the press releases around the time of the Sony hack was much lower than the anger level around the time of the threat against Guam. So one of the ways to think about this might be that if you don't intend to make good on your threat, you might be more inclined to just blow off steam or bloviate a bit more, but that if you do intend to make good on the threat, that you might hold something in reserve because you know that a bigger action is forthcoming, right? So you see a lower, more constrained set of angry language around the Sony hack, which they did make good on, right? Then the bar graph on the right is from more of a content analysis of the North Korean state media across time between 1997 and 2015. And what this particular topic is about anti-imperialist rhetoric. And so what we see toward the end of Kim Jong-il's regime is a sharp decline in the amount of anti-imperialist rhetoric. And then right around the time that Kim Jong-un takes power, you see the sharp spike, right, in 2011. And so there's a lot of discussion about rally around the flag and about diversionary theory. And so we know that Kim Jong-il had a lot to prove in his early years he didn't have much military experience. He was not necessarily well regarded and thought of as being well prepared for the position. And so one of the ways to get people on side is to find a convenient external enemy. And so that's what we see in that huge spike in 2011. This is from a paper that was published in International Interactions, learning about politics from words in hard-to-observe groups. So we looked at all of the leaders across the Middle East and North Africa during the Arab Spring and tried to see what language was descriptive about those who lost power and those who stayed in power. So for the leaders that stayed in power, overall they tended to use more positive language, less negative language, less anxious and less angry words. Those who lost power used twice as many negative emotion words and more words associated with risk and more third-person pronouns, which tends to be like the us versus them kind of rhetoric. And so we see these are not necessarily predictive features, but they certainly do trend toward describing the kind of language that leaders use when they're trying to stay in power. That in general, the saying that when you're slinging mud, you're losing ground, we kind of see this borne out in this with the negative emotion language in those who lost power. So this is a really exciting corpus that we were able to collect from the Conflict Records Research Center before it closed back in 2015. So we were able to gather a bunch of documents from the Saddam Hussein regime that were gathered after the fall, after the invasion in 2003. And so we looked at what was being discussed in these topics. What was it? There were so many things that policymakers and scholars didn't know about what was going on inside the regime. And so now we get, behind the curtains peek at what the regime level language was. So, there's a lot on all of the redundancy between security organizations within the regime. There's some really nice transcripts that show different power dynamics. There's in some of them, as we were reading through, it was a bit of theater of the absurd with some of the suggestions that were made by some of the people who were higher up in the Ba'ath Party about how to deal with Iran. So this can really give us a lot of insight into what's going on in personalist authoritarian regimes that, around, 2001 to 2003, there was so much talk about the axis of evil, and we kind of tend to lump all the bad guys together as one uniform, singular group that all have common features and properties. But we see that there's a lot of difference between types of authoritarians. So with this particular corpus, we get underneath and inside what was going on within the regime. Okay, so as you've noticed, most of these, all of these have been from areas in the world that are not Western developed countries. So this issue of bias in what we call text as data, so treating words as data points and turning words into numbers so that we can look at big picture patterns. How do we learn about political processes in opaque societies and extremist groups? And even more than that, how do we know what we know about the world? So sources describe events and ideas differently based on language and culture and geography. The research about language and politics broadly has deficiencies which affect the conclusions and the generalizability of our findings. These include things like information deficiencies. So in many societies, the political documents are not, archiving is not at the forefront of the regime's thinking. So documents may be discarded haphazardly or gathered and archived haphazardly. They they may be stored in a basement and the documents get moldy, or, when you're looking at other documents from, say, Rwanda, we'll see this in a couple of slides, things were typewritten and scanned sideways with, things stamped on top of them. And so some of it it's not some of the information is not available because the regime is not prioritizing archiving. I mean, there's the type of information that's available from countries like the U.S. and the UK and New Zealand and the Netherlands. I mean, it's part of the automated process of collecting and storing the data, but this is not necessarily the case everywhere in the world. And then there's the corpus generation. That a lot of these things are really difficult to generate. So, for example, the Rwanda corpus that I'm working with took several years to process and extract the information. And there's a pretty steep learning curve for people just getting into the text as data field for all of the software. And, this is one of the highlights of partnering across disciplines, right? Working with computer scientists and data scientists. And then there's the linguistic pipeline. That most of the available tools run only on English language or Western language corpora, right? Like the Romance languages and Chinese and Hindi and Arabic. It's very difficult to find syntactic and semantic tools that will work with those in their original language. Now, translation is an option, and one of the things that my team and I found was that Google Translate is actually really good in many circumstances for translated documents. But the closer that you can get to the primary source, the better, right? Retaining the original message and intent that the sender tried to convey. So why it's important to dig and work for broader source texts? Well, there's relatively few groups and regimes that dominate the policy space, and in many cases we still rely on translations and secondary sources rather than developing tools that can let us examine and in an automated way the language that's coming out of these places. And then generalizability. So if we're taking Western constructs and superimposing them on non-Western societies, that's a problem because that often does not square with what the realities are on the other side. So this is one of the corpora that I was talking about, the Rwandan genocide. So what I did was I looked at the Davenport and Stam data that they gathered. So there's 5 different groups that collected casualty data for the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and then they advocate using the composite measure of all 5 of those. And so what I did was I did this topic modeling process, and then looked at how what topics actually predicted more casualties, right? The standard narrative is that RTLM was largely responsible for inciting and fostering the genocide in Rwanda. But what I find is that it's a lot more nuanced than that there are some topics in particular and some presenters for the RTLM program that were much more influential in inciting people to violence. And that there were some topics that really had no association with violence. So there's a lot more contour within the data rather than just saying the media made them do it, right? So here you can see the debiasing the linguistic analysis and document processing. So things are stored in user-unfriendly formats. Automated document processing like optical character recognition is certainly available, but a lot of this technology requires a lot of human-in-the-loop intensive supervision and corrections. And there are a lot of linguistic and translational barriers. There are some bag of words programs that are language agnostic, such as topic modeling, which I used on the Rwandan corpus. And translations, as I mentioned, are overall reliable, but not universally so. And as I mentioned, it's better to work in the primary language. So in thinking about how language and culture help shape how we see the world, and the question of how what we say reveals who we are, and why it's important that we develop more tools that will help us analyze in primary languages, what we see here is just a Google Ngram search in each of these languages. The picture shows results from war and from conflict. So we've got English, German, French, Russian, Chinese, and Hebrew. And what we see generally, conflict and war are strongly semantically related, right? And often interchangeable, that you can use them in the same context. But what we see here is that they're used in practice in very different ways. So in English, over time, we see two peaks around war, so World War I, World War II, whereas we see this gradual increase in the use of the term conflict, right? So in practice, they're used in very different ways. And this kind of squares with the types of wars that are generally occurring in the world, right? We get a lot more civil conflicts later in time, this is between 1900 and 2000. And you see across the war column that they're generally similar patterns, although China, the Chinese results look quite different. But generally there's, two peaks around World War I and World War II. And then in general, in the conflict column, we see general patterns of just a gradual increase over time. But they're different enough to make me think that these two terms are being talked about in very, very different ways. So not everybody sees and conceptualizes war in the same way, and not everybody conceptualizes conflict in the same way. And over time, that time matters too, because we know that words and word meanings are not stable, and that they do evolve. And we can see that real plainly here. In thinking about the role of culture, we've got this standard trope that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And this really gets at, where you stand characterizes the way you see a similar phenomenon, right? In the same way that people standing on opposite street corners can describe a car accident in different ways because of their vantage point, the same thing applies to language. So there might be, if you think about a particular terrorist event, if you are on the sending side, you might see that event and describe that event very differently than if you're on the receiving side, right? So in my workflow, I think about kind of triangulating with three different approaches into people's political concepts, with semantics and syntax, with sentiment, and with topics. And I'll go through these briefly. So I use 5 different syntactic components, the first of which is syntactic simplicity and complexity. So you'll see, if you're sending a text message, you might say, I can't, an email, I cannot, and then an essay of 2,000 words, I'm unable to can, right? With increasing levels of complexity. Over the last week, the Christmas carols have been playing on the radio here, and what struck me was one of the carols of What Child Is This? What child is this who laid to rest on Mary's lap is sleeping, right? It takes 11 words to get to the main verb there, right? And so your brain is constantly trying to find the end. And so it's much more cognitively demanding to read and understand something like I am unable to can, because your brain has more trouble keeping all of that information in its working memory, right, as compared to I can't. Okay, the difference between word concreteness and abstractness. So this is from the UNGA General Debate from the Chinese representative in 2012. We see these really broad constructs like friendly, cooperation, countries, peaceful coexistence, relations, respect, cooperation, good neighborly relationships, partnerships, neighborhood. they're not talking about specific instances of things. They're talking about community building. And the countries that I showed in the world map that tended to be shaded more blue tend to speak like this. They tend to use more abstract words that really get people on board with broad brush strokes. The next construct I look at is whether or not what someone is saying exhibits kind of the traditional narrative arc versus being very expository or list-like. So this is a speech from Rodrigo Duterte from 2016, and it is very expository. So reduce requirements in the processing time, remove redundant requirements, refrain from changing and bending. If you read this paragraph and then an hour later somebody asks you to recall all of the points in this paragraph, you probably have a difficult time, right? Rather than if you were asked to recall what the Chinese representative said at the UNGA, you would say peace and neighbors, right? Because those things are stickier. It's harder to remember expository lists. But when things are presented in a narrative way within exposition, rising action, climax, falling, and resolution, our brains understand how to hang the information on that existing construct. So deep cohesion and shallow cohesion represent two different ways that documents or speeches make sense. So deep cohesion means that the entirety of what is being said or written about broadly hangs together, right? It's on a theme, right? The documents that have deep cohesion are not easily quotable or soundbiteable because they comprise a lot of different facets on an issue. Referential cohesion, on the other hand, is more shallow and more localized. So what we see here from Venezuela in 2004 at the UNGA, so we get moments, nation, people, stand, moments, leaders, people, world, stand, war, fighting, military, force, right? You get both, you get repeated, exact words repeated, and you get semantically similar words. And so as adult learners, we learn by repetition, and the more times things are repeated, the easier it is for us to remember. And documents or speeches with high referential cohesion do tend to be more quotable and make for better sound bites. I also look at sentiment. Sentiment is really useful in analyzing things like truthfulness and deception. I just taught a class this semester called Deception 101, How to Spot a Liar. This is one of my favorite statements to analyze. So this is an email from Harold Ford Jr. after he was accused of misconduct. He wrote, "Hey, very sorry, meant no harm, and I apologize for whatever I may have said or what was said, and my overtures are strictly professional. Again, I apologize, didn't mean to be inappropriate at all. Sorry, that impression was left." So in the deception detection and lying analysis, one of the things that we look at is the sincerity of apologies. So as compared to other really good apologies, like Delta Airlines gives really good public apologies. Whoever writes their apologies does a really, really great job. This one really misses the mark, though, and on these fronts. So first of all, pronoun drop, right? Hey, very sorry. There's a pronoun missing there, right? And a verb, like I am very sorry. Meant no harm. I meant no harm. There's a huge distinction there. So the pronoun drop. And I apologize for what I may have said or what was said. What we see here is passive voice. Again, I apologize, didn't mean to be inappropriate at all. Sorry, that impression was left. That's like the classic sorry, not sorry. I'm sorry you mistook what I said, or I'm sorry that you misunderstood, right? So the passive voice, the pronoun drop, and then the third thing that really strikes me is in a paragraph of past tense, we get this present tense verb right in the middle, and my overtures are strictly professional, which tends to suggest ongoing behavior, right? This is something that I'm really excited about. This fall, I started looking into wargaming exercises and what we can learn about the process of deliberations during the wargaming exercise, not just who wins or loses, but how they arrive at that at the end result, right? So we see in this particular wargaming exercise, there are 3 rounds, and this is mean pronoun use, right? So of all the participants, there are very few pronouns that were used in the first round, more in the second round, and even more in the third round. And that's really indicative of growing rapport between the groups, even amongst competing groups. So that's a really fascinating trend. The other, on the right, is a term called affiliation. So that's the degree to which you feel like you're a part of the group. And when I saw this, you know, I'm just learning more about wargaming exercises, but on the right, you see kinship groups and community women and tribal leaders, right? So people that have affiliations and that are socially affiliated with each other, they do tend to use more social and group affiliation kind of language, right? So this is really exciting for me and something that I'm looking forward to continuing working on. So the sentiment analysis, there's a lot of different programs that can be used. There's 2 classes of words. There's closed class and open class. Closed class words are things like pronouns and prepositions and conjunctions and articles. In general, there's not a lot of innovation, although with there are some new personal pronouns with increased awareness about gender and diversity, right? But in general, those are fairly stable. But then open class words, we get all kinds of novel portmanteaus and innovated words. So the nouns, the concrete words. But the function words really matter because they're the most frequently occurring, and yet they occur and they're processed and perceived really below the surface of awareness, right? So say you watch the State of the Union speech and somebody asks you the next day what the president talked about. You know, you might say, oh, terrorism and education and immigration and, you know, whatever else. You wouldn't say, oh, he talked about the and for and to, right? Even though those are the most frequently occurring words, and they're processed in different ways in the brain. One of the ways that this matters is in the UN Security Council Resolution 242. So in English, territories does not require a determiner, right? An article, a, an, or the, or some, right? But in French, which is also one of the official UN languages, words are forced to take a determiner. And so what we get here with the word des is some lexical ambiguity. It can either mean of the, right, or it can mean some. And so we get this, the real world interpretation is that, you know, do you withdraw the armed forces from the territories or some of the territories? Because this little word, des, makes that ambiguous. This is a project I've been working on for several years, also a part of the Minerva initiative, and this is trying to debias and diversify the corpus generation. So Coh-MetrixML, which stands for multi-lingual. We're trying to scale up the syntactic and semantic computational linguistics programs to Chinese, French, Arabic, Spanish, German, and possibly Russian, extending beyond English only. And this will allow us in these primary languages, which cover, you know, a substantial portion of the world's population, allow us to understand more about the way, the process and the structure of language, and not just what is being said. So the advantage to Coh-Metrix is that it circumvents the translation deficiencies. It broadens the domain of corpora available for scholarly and policy inquiry. It maintains fidelity to the original intent and meaning of the corpus, and it can be aligned with other text processing methods as well. This is the final slide, second to last slide. One of the things that I wanted to do for the Text as Data community was to consolidate all of the different text analysis programs, and it's constantly growing and evolving and changing landscape, but have one place where people could go to find these analytical text programs and connect with other researchers and look at data, and if you're interested in teaching text as data or computational text analysis, have to the repository of syllabi. So I developed quanttext.com, which is a queryable database of programs. And I think that's it. Next question. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. So if you have questions in the audience, please indicate so in chat or raise your hand if we have that function, and I will call on you as soon as I can. I see Manny, Lieutenant Colonel Zepeda is already in there. Let me ask a few introduction kind of questions. And first off, I have to state that any future apology email I write, and there will be many in my career, are going to have to go through you because, yeah, I drop pronouns all the time. I think dropping pronouns is like a big text thing. I don't know. I kind of talk like that in my head.
It is, but you know what? It's something that once you know it, you can't unknow it. Like, back when in-person conferences were still a thing, sometimes people would come up to me afterwards and say, really enjoyed your talk. And I would say, tell me more. What didn't you like? Versus like, I really enjoyed your talk. So once you can't unknow it, like you can't unsee it once you recognize pronoun drop.
Yeah. I've always advocated lately too that all DC functions should start with this is what bothered me about your talk. But in fact, actually nothing bothered me about your talk. I think it's critical. I think it's important. But let's get a quick and easy summary out for our DoD community. Why does the DoD need to start paying attention to text analysis, sentiment analysis, natural language processing, and all the coming advances? What will the PME community get out of this? And why do they need to be paying attention?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's kind of low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, these are not hard things to do. And I think that they can help us anticipate what other allies or adversaries are likely to do in the future. If we're looking at past trends and the degree to which past behavior predicts future behavior, I think it's important because it can let us know on a deeper level how people estimate a situation. So not just what they say, but how they're saying it. And there's so many new advances in semantic relationships and word choice, and why someone says this and not this. One of the, I didn't present on this here today, but there's a really growing field of multimodal communication analysis and aligning multiple modalities. So link rate, for example, or changes in fundamental frequency, and triangulating behavior across multiple modalities, not just what people say, but the entire communicative package, how loud people talk, all kinds of different features. But it's important because it gets at the way that people see themselves in groups, what their relative power and their relative position. And it's just so doable to automate and to get better real-time analysis of situations and not just have to look retrospectively at data.
So let me ask a follow-up then. We used to have a center called Krulak, I forget what it stood for, but it's basically our cultural center, which has been consolidated into the CRSS, which is the Center for Regional Security Studies. So how do these traditional modes of looking at culture and regional studies, how do they need to change and evolve given the advances of AI tools that are entering this domain?
What do you mean by culture?
Well, that's a question for the people, but they do a lot of cross-cultural communication, working with our future leaders as they might end up in combat zones, how they deal with culture. I'm not sure exactly on their methodological approach, but the question is really what needs to change going into the future given the advances that we have now.
Okay, so here's a really good example of that. I do a cross-cultural workshop for a group here in Memphis every summer, and one of the things we talk about is how people say no in different cultures. And so if your culture doesn't allow you to just outright say no, you might say that might not be possible, or that would be difficult. And so if you're coming from pull yourself up by your bootstraps, can do, that would be difficult, but okay, we can work with difficult. But what they really mean is no, right? But they can't say no because it's not culturally permissible. Arriving, yeah. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just probably breathing heavily. Sorry.
So yeah, arriving at a resolution and understanding how people perceive the problem. The fundamentals of conflict resolution is make sure you're fighting about the same thing, and people might have very different perceptions about the conflict. Like the slide that I showed about the one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? You could apply that to almost any situation. So, say that there's, what do people believe about, closing down overseas military bases or something, right? If you're surveying the local population, or realignment in the Philippines, right? What do the Filipino people and leaders think about China or regional conflicts? What is the effect of withdrawal from major international commitments, right? Whether it's the World Trade Organization or NAFTA, or the International Postal Union, or the TPP or Brexit or whatever. Having a way to demonstrate and model that people see these problems very differently. And that the way that they describe it is very different.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, that's important. We're going to have to engage you on that moving forward. Let me ask a little bit about event data, though. I've worked with event data, and I remember very vividly my co-author came to me and my other co-author one day and said, looking at iChoose, Phil Schroedt's data, America was engaged in 44 wars from 1999 to 2010. And we had to say, no, this is entirely wrong. This is a problem. So one of the challenges, of course, is the fidelity of the data and the finesse of the data that comes through event data, and a lot of the noise. And so how do we deal with that issue in the DoD when we really need to be accurate, when our students really need to have a clear grasp of what's going on? And how do we leverage these issues moving forward?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and really, really, really important, because in many of the event data sets, you get multiple instances of the same event, such as the commemoration of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki every August, right? That registers as an event every year. And so you have to know how to filter that out so you're not counting, a nuclear war every year. The other issue, though, is that the way that the events are constructed is reflective of a particular fixed point in time, and it doesn't necessarily capture the nuances of civil conflicts, for example, or new innovations. And so, it's really difficult from an NLP perspective to kind of capture and categorize every event. But I think that we can do better with that, especially because most of the data sources are derived from kind of global gold standard sources like the New York Times or the AP or the AFP, right? But so, for example, with IQs, one of the problems that was identified during the Arab Spring was that they missed the Arab Spring, right? This data set missed the onset of the Arab Spring. And, in thinking about this, it really seems like if we're not modeling and not incorporating local news sources, if we're just waiting until it filters up to the New York Times, then we've already missed the boat, right? We're already late. So we have to be able to capture events at a more localized level in order to accurately model what's going on in the world. Hi, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I love all the stuff going on in the background. I think I have a little tiny curvy here, but if there was a cat, there's children going through. That's great.
Yes.
And kind
Ask
of
me
related.
how I feel about virtual kindergarten.
I was just reading an article about the inadequacy of online education, but that's a whole other issue.
Love it.
Related to this though, is automated text analysis, is automated NLP, are these paths to removing bias from our data? And this is a chance for you to talk about gender and everything else that you're engaged in, because I think that's incredibly important work.
Does automation remove bias? Well, you get out what you put in. So the more representative the training sets are, the more accurate the analysis is going to be. The more, hi, thank you. What I'm finding during the pandemic is that it takes my brain so much longer to boot back up into what I was thinking. With distractions.
I have no sense of time and place anymore, so
right. Every day is the same except garbage day. In terms of gender and bias, we have so few women leaders in the world that it's really hard to model gender and language because you're drawing from such a small set. We've got an R&R right now, a group of my colleagues and I do, on the role that perceptions of gender played in the early period of the COVID pandemic. Back in March, April, May, June, people were just falling all over themselves saying, women are doing such a great job. These women leaders are they're doing so much better in the pandemic. And what we find is actually they're not. They're doing about the same, but that they're descriptive measures that matter. And it really is, we get back to culture. It really is about the Hofstede 6 cultural dimensions that matter, that in this society, if there's less power distance between individuals in society, if there's more equality between men and women and less fixation on prescribed gender roles and more tolerance for ambiguity, more long-term orientation, those are the kind of society level features that tend to make people elect women leaders. But there's still deeply held values, even if the society has elected a man who's a leader, right, a male world leader. So it's not that women are doing better. They're certainly talking differently about things in the pandemic, but the outcomes are about equal in terms of deaths per capita.
Okay, great. Lieutenant Colonel Zepeda, I think you have a few questions here, so I think you can unpack this.
Yes. So as you were presenting, one of the things that jumped out at me was you just mentioned connections, and just wondering if you could slightly expand on that and what the significance of that is when you're trying to interact with other folks and maybe affect or influence their perceptions. And that kind of leads into the next elongated excerpt from our joint doctrine, which speaks to the domain, and I think it very much deals with what you're speaking about here.
Tell me what you mean more about it. So I know how I understand causal connections. Tell me more about what you mean.
Well, when you were
what were you thinking of? What was the example that you were thinking of?
Well, when you were mentioning that there is a certain way of receiving or interpreting information, and that causes people to react in different ways. And to a certain extent, those are from behavior, whether it's text analysis or whatnot. We can make inferences and have it predictive of what can happen in the future. So that was very interesting to me. I think it's significant in a greater whole, and some of the things that we think about in the military, that is very much inside of what we codify as the operational information environment. So it's something that is being dealt with right now in the military, and it has a tremendous significance. So if you can expand on that, it'd be great.
Sure. I'm going to use an example from domestic politics because I think that it really illustrates what you're asking about well. So the difference between deep cohesion and shallow cohesion, or referential cohesion, is really about how people organize information in their heads and how they think about problems. So, for example, not coming down on either side of this, just giving it as an example. If you ask a Republican, what's the problem with immigration, right? You're going to get a very straightforward subject, verb, object. This is the problem. These are the problem. They are the problem, right? If you ask somebody who's a Democrat what the problem with immigration is, you're probably going to get an answer like, well, it's complicated, right? And so it really, the way that people organize information and the way they talk about it reflects how they think about it. So the very top-down, like, if you think about this being a top-down triangle, right? If the way that you think about things is, this is the problem, right? Then you've got a pinpoint. You've got a thing to target or a person to target. If the way that you think about things is, well, it's complicated, right? Where you start with the most broad and then eventually work your way down to a target or a point. Neither is right or wrong. People just genuinely think about the world in different ways. And so with the causal connections, that's much more reflective of the bottom up. So going from the most complex down to, eventually if you make it there, down to the most simple, versus a top down where you say this is the problem, and then eventually it gets more complicated, or eventually you entertain more features or more elements of that. So there is sort of there's some really cool work that was done on straightforwardness of language along partisan lines in Western Europe. And I found a similar thing in some of the U.S. domestic debates on issues. And so, in general, simpler is better. It's easier for people to understand, subject, verb, object. The example that I gave earlier about the Christmas hymn of, what child is this who laid to rest on Mary's lap is sleeping, right? That's hard to parse. And so it's pretty and it's lyrical, but it's not necessarily useful in conveying information. And so, the easiest way for, we human beings to process and integrate information is in really straightforward styles, right? Subject, verb, object. There's one of the features that we look at in the syntactic and semantic program that I use that counts the number of words before the main verb, right? And there's a huge variation in that amongst different political perspectives, amongst conservatives and liberals. So in general, shorter is better and more to the point is better, at least for comprehension and retention. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And just to highlight, I mean, that's very interesting to me to at least hear you make a connection between that and how that can be predictive in nature. It is just pretty amazing to be able to think about that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Anyone else jumping in here? So for my last question, and I think I've kind of asked you this in a similar way before, DoD gives you $5 million. What would you do with that to improve overall our ability to deal with natural language processing and text analysis moving forward, and how can we better serve the community?
Well, I think, first of all, scaling up the syntactic analysis programs, because that really tells us a lot, like what I was just saying with the deep and the referential, or the deep and the shallow cohesion. I think scaling those up would be first priority, and continuing to develop more NLP tools to analyze speech or text data in primary languages. You think about the different places in the world, whether it's, Burma or Nepal or Venezuela or the Philippines, or any of the major problems in the world, things like, rising populism, and the problem of fake news. All of these things, they're not unique to English language speakers. And so having the analytical tools to be able to do basic research in original languages would be an enormous advance. And now here's the problem. The problem is that many of these programs fund basic research. And this kind of technology, or the kind of instruments that that I'm talking about developing, are perceived as somewhat too applied, right? Like, in many cases, the DoD doesn't want more tools in the toolbox, right? Because, everybody comes up with something, new or fancy, or the latest flash in the pan. But I'm still struggling with a way to convey that you need these tools to be able to get to the basic research in these other languages, because they're behind the linguistic firewall right now, right? We don't know what's going on in other languages or in other societies, because we're not looking at them in their own languages. And so we need to develop these tools, which are an actual product, but the product isn't the point. The point is to be able to develop the product so that then we can just open the floodgates for all of this data and information that's locked in non-English language, non-Western language environments, right? So I think it's difficult to make this sell because it seems too applied, but that's not the end of the story, right? The story is that you need these tools to be able to get to the basic research.
Okay, great. Well, we thank you for your presentation. We thank you for your work, and we look forward to seeing more from you in the future.
Thank you so much.
So, thank you.
What a treat.
Okay, well, that's it from us. Ian,
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Dr. Valeriano, and thank you to Dr. Windsor. That was an outstanding presentation on an area that I expect very few of us had any familiarity with at all. So that's a very useful piece to add to our toolkit of PME available to our students here. And I'll try to have the final video up on our YouTube channel here in the next couple of days.
Sure.
And I'll do my best to edit out little people running around on the screen. We'll see how well I can do that.
The cat tail.
Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge with my my post-production skills here.
It's okay.
Yeah, but it's all good. So again, thank you very much for taking time out to join us. And so we're to the rest of the audience here, thanks for coming back to the Brewcast this week. We hope you'll join us next week, where we'll be hosting Team Krulak non-resident fellow and retired Lieutenant General of Marines Mike Dana to look at warfare in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And we very much look forward to his insights. So we'll see you all then. Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.